The Voice of America now brings you a special rebroadcast from the National Broadcasting Company of the German unconditional surrender in Italy.
German forces in Italy have surrendered unconditionally to the Supreme Allied Commander. The instrument of surrender, the first formal surrender by a German army or armies since Allied troops first stormed the shores of Europe nearly 20 months ago, was signed at 2:14 Italy time on Sunday afternoon, April 29th. The surrender became effective at 2 p.m. Italy time today. All German and Italian forces under General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, successor to Marshal Kesselring as Commander-in-Chief of the German Southwest Command, formally laid down their arms just 4.5 hours ago. The war in Italy is over, and this is probably the first announcement to the listening world. The document of surrender was signed in a small chamber at Allied Force headquarters in the great Royal Palace of Caserta, north of Naples. Since last July, the palace has been headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean Theater. A white-haired, red-faced, stocky Englishman, Lieutenant General W.D. Morgan, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, signed for the Allies. Two men in civilian clothes, a lieutenant colonel and a major, signed for the Germans. 13 generals and staff officers of the Allied land, sea, and air forces in the Mediterranean looked on. A Red Army Major General, A.P. Kislenko, was there for the Russians. 6 men, of whom I was one, were present for the American and British press. The negotiations that culminated in this scene at Caserta were short and swift. A few days before the signing, the German command in northern Italy got word through to us that it was ready to sue for surrender. On Saturday afternoon, April 28th, an Army transport plane bore south through a driving rainstorm and landed at the Caserta airfield at 4 o'clock. There were 2 civilian passengers. One was tall, blond, blue-eyed, square-jawed, and terribly tense. The other was sleek, small, dark, and apparently unmoved. The tall German, a lieutenant colonel, had papers authorizing him to negotiate on behalf of General von Vietinghoff. That meant the German 10th and 14th Armies and the Italian Ligurian Army, an enemy force that totaled perhaps 600,000 men. The dark and unperturbed German was a major. He represented General Karl Wolff, Supreme Commander of SS and security troops in northern Italy and western Austria. That meant perhaps another 250 or 300,000 enemy troops. There were many reasons, of course, for the secrecy. There were particular reasons for the civilian clothes. The German generals were acting on their own. As far as is known, they negotiated this separate surrender without consulting their higher command. They were prepared on their own to carry out the surrender terms without instructions from above. Negotiations at Caserta began late Saturday afternoon. Lieutenant General Morgan led them on the Allied side. By Sunday morning, he had convinced the German delegates that surrender must be unconditional or not at all. In the small chamber at the Royal Palace, 8 spotlights were trained on a long table, behind which hung a big operational map of the Po Valley. The table was bare, except for a pen and inkwell at either end. The walls were bare, except for the Po Valley map and another map of Vienna. The ceiling bore the coats of arms of various Italian provinces, and one souvenir of another era, the sign of the Fasces. It was 2 o'clock, and staff officers were buzzing importantly in and out, arranging the formalities involved in the supreme military act of surrender. At 5 minutes after 2, the door to the right opened, and the Allied officers filed in. Among them were American and British generals, rear admirals, and an air vice-marshal. General Morgan came last. As he stood at his end of the table, he seemed the embodiment of all you think of as a British Army general, red-faced, impeccable, and utterly calm. An Englishman next to me remarked, "He looks like General Haig. It's extraordinary." The door to the left of the long table opened. The 2 Germans stepped in and halted awkwardly before the waiting inkwell. The tall lieutenant colonel stared a moment defiantly at the spotlights. His blue eyes burned as they rapidly took in the assembly. His throat muscles were taut, and his hands were clenched fiercely behind his back. but he stood firm and erect like a soldier as General Morgan glanced down at him the length of the table. The little German, the dark major, stood to one side unruffled. Despite the contrast between the gold braid and pomp of uniform of the Allies and the checkered sports jackets and bright ties and flannel trousers of the Germans, there was nothing ludicrous, no hint of incongruity in this dramatic scene. General Morgan began. In a calm, unemotional voice that was cutting in its firmness, he addressed the Germans. I understand that you, Lieutenant Colonel X, are prepared to sign terms of surrender on behalf of General von Bietinghoff, and you, Major X, are prepared to sign on behalf of General Wolf. Is this correct? The tall German's throat muscles quivered, and he replied in a hoarse voice, Ja, and the little German said Jawohl when the question was translated to him. General Morgan continued. I have been empowered by Field Marshal Alexander to sign on his behalf. The terms of the instrument of surrender will take effect at 12 noon, British Mean Time, on the 2nd of May, 1945. I now ask you to sign the documents, and I will sign after you. The German colonel's tension had mounted as General Morgan spoke. It was as though the enormity of defeat and the finality of his present act of total surrender had now hit him with a cold shock. Perhaps the spotlights angered him too, but whatever he felt, he did not lose his self-control. He asked to repeat a statement he had made at previous meetings. In a husky voice, he said for the record that he had received limited powers from his commander-in-chief, that he had been forced to overstep those limits, that he assumed his commander would approve his action, but that he could not be absolutely sure. General Morgan replied casually, "We accept those conditions." The German sat and signed 5 copies of the surrender document. General Morgan signed last. 3 copies, one of them in German, were given to the German plenipotentiaries. 2 were kept by us for the Supreme Commander and the Allied governments. General Morgan explained this to the Germans and said, "Gentlemen, I ask you to withdraw now." The Germans went swiftly out. It was 17 minutes after 2. The ceremony was over. There had been no show of victory on the side of the Allies, only the tone of cool authority of General Morgan's voice, his easy manner, his quiet dignity. But for the Germans, it had been overwhelming defeat, the end, the last nail in the coffin. The frontline troops involved in this surrender are those we've been fighting here ever since we landed at Salerno. They are perhaps the best in the Wehrmacht. They comprise 22 divisions from 2 German armies, including 1 Panzer, 2 Panzer Grenadier, and 2 parachute divisions, which were always among the Germans' finest. It's impossible to estimate their number today, but at the start of our offensive in northern Italy, the 22 divisions were believed well up to strength. Their total at that time, an AFHQ staff officer estimates, was 600,000. They are all the German troops in Italy as far east as the Isonzo River, where the next German territorial command begins. General Karl Wolff's SS and security troops are mostly in the rear. They are, in fact, almost wholly in Austria. Wolff's area command covers the Tyrol, part of Carinthia, and the province of Salzburg, the part of Austria roughly west of a north-south line through Salzburg itself. The troops under the 2 commands of Wolff and von Bietinghoff probably totaled close to 1 million 1 month ago. The surrender which 2 Germans in sports clothes signed last Sunday means more than the end of the war in Italy. It carries us automatically across the Alps. If all German troops obey the surrender conditions and lay down their arms, we will clear the whole route of the Brenner Pass in a single swoop and reach northward to within a few miles of Berchtesgaden.
We now bring you the text of a statement by President Harry S. Truman.
Here is a statement by the President of the United States. We quote, "The Allied armies in Italy have won the unconditional surrender of German forces on the first European soil to which, from the West, we carried our arms and our determination. The collapse of military tyranny in Italy, however, is no victory in Italy alone, but a part of a general triumph we are expectantly awaiting on the whole continent of Europe. Only folly and chaos can now delay the general capitulation of the everywhere defeated German armies. I have dispatched congratulatory messages to the Allied and American officers who led our forces to complete defeat of the Germans in Italy. They deserve our praise for the victory. We have right to be proud of the success of our armies. The statement of the President continues. Let Germany and Japan understand the meaning of these events. Unless they are lost in fanaticism or determined upon suicide, they must recognize the meaning of the increasing, swifter moving power now ready for the capitulation or the destruction of the so recently arrogant enemies of mankind. The President has sent the following message to Field Marshal Alexander. On this momentous occasion of the surrender of the German armed forces in Italy, I convey to you from the President and the people of the United States congratulations on the signal success of the Allied armies, navies, and air forces under your command, gained only by persistent heroic effort through many months of a most difficult campaign. I send also to you personally our appreciation of the high order of your leaderships which conducted our armies to their complete victory. End quote.
We have just brought you a special rebroadcast from the National Broadcasting Company on the unconditional surrender of the Germans in Italy, and also the text of a statement by President Harry S. Truman. This is the United States of America.